I came out here for peace. That's what everyone says, isn't it? To escape the city, the noise, the endless demands. This cabin, tucked away so deep in the forgotten woods, felt like a sanctuary, a place where the only sounds would be the wind through the pines and the crackle of my own fire. For weeks, that's exactly what it was, just me, the trees, and the vast, silent wilderness. But then, the silence started to change. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it was watchful. I began to notice things, small things at first. A faint scratching sound that wasn't a branch against the window. A shadow moving just beyond the tree line, too solid for a deer. My coffee mug left on the porch, turned upside down. I told myself it was animals, it had to be. But deep down, I knew. The woods had always been empty. My cabin, however, wasn't. And I was no longer alone. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. That cold, certain knowledge burrowed deep into my bones, chilling me far more than any winter wind. No longer alone. The words echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the cabin, a silence that now felt less like peace and more like a held breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the stillness. Every shadow stretched, every creak of the old wood became a potential movement, a lurking presence. My eyes darted around the familiar room, seeing it anew, scrutinizing every corner, every piece of furniture, as if the answer, the thing, might suddenly materialize before me. I gripped the mug I'd been holding, my knuckles white, the lukewarm coffee forgotten. This wasn't a fox turning over a cup or a squirrel scratching. This was something else, something intelligent, something patient. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. The moment my eyes closed, the sounds intensified. Faint rustlings under the floorboards, almost like something dragging itself across the rough-hewn planks. I'd snap awake, heart pounding, listening into the oppressive darkness, straining to hear, to understand. Sometimes I'd hear a faint, almost imperceptible whisper just beyond the threshold of hearing, like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor or a breath ghosting across my ear. I'd sit bolt upright, clutching the worn blanket to my chest, my breath catching in my throat, until the first sliver of dawn painted the sky a hesitant gray. Only then, with the promise of light, would the sounds recede, leaving me drained and hollow-eyed. I started barricading the door at night, piling up chairs and a small table, a futile gesture I knew, but one that offered a sliver of psychological comfort. I checked the windows repeatedly, pushing the old stiff latches until my fingers ached. But the feeling of being watched didn't come from outside anymore. It was within the cabin walls, a suffocating awareness that permeated every room. I'd turn from the stove, convinced I'd seen a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a darker patch in the already dim hallway. I'd spin around, only to find nothing but the familiar, empty space. Yet the feeling persisted, a cold prickle on the back of my neck, a sense of eyes on me, always. One morning, I found a small, smooth, gray stone on my kitchen table. It wasn't a stone from around my cabin. These woods were mostly granite and shale, rough and jagged. This one was perfectly oval, unnaturally smooth, like river stone, but there was no river nearby. I picked it up, feeling its cool weight, a strange dread coiling in my stomach. I hadn't opened the windows, the door had been bolted. How had it gotten there? I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to conjure a rational explanation. Had I brought it in myself and forgotten? No, I would remember a stone like this. It felt placed, a message, a calling card. I threw it out into the woods, as far as I could, watching it disappear into the undergrowth, feeling a perverse sense of defiance. But later that day, I found another one, identical, sitting on my pillow. My appetite vanished. Food tasted like ash. I spent my days cleaning, scrubbing, trying to reclaim the space, to impose order on the encroaching chaos. But it was useless. Every surface I cleaned seemed to gather dust faster. Every floorboard I swept seemed to creak louder. The silence, when it came, was no longer peaceful. It was pregnant with expectation, a heavy, waiting silence. I started talking to myself, whispering denials, pleas, demands into the empty rooms, hoping to break the spell, to assert my presence. But my voice just sounded small and lost. Then came the footsteps. Not outside, not under the floorboards. Upstairs. My cabin only had a small attic space, accessible by a pull-down ladder. I'd never used it for anything other than storing some old boxes. The sounds started subtly, soft thumps, like something heavy shifting. Then they became more distinct, a slow, deliberate pacing, directly above my bedroom. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too regular, too heavy. I'd stand frozen in the living room, staring up at the ceiling, my breath held captive in my lungs, listening to whatever it was, moving around in the space above me. Sometimes it would stop directly overhead, and I'd feel an almost palpable weight, an oppressive presence pressing down. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling, the wood expanding and contracting. But the rhythm was wrong. The intent was too clear. One night, the pacing stopped. I was huddled in my bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, anticipating the next heavy step. But it didn't come. Instead, a new sound began. A soft, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, coming from the attic access panel directly above my head. Scratching. It wasn't frantic, not desperate. It was slow, deliberate, almost exploring, like someone testing the surface, feeling their way. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it penetrated, a chilling vibration that resonated through the mattress, through my very bones. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, a statue of terror, until the first hint of morning light pierced the blinds, and the scratching, like all the other sounds, abruptly ceased. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a feeling or a series of strange occurrences. This was a direct, undeniable challenge. It was in my home. It was above me. It was waiting. The cabin, my sanctuary, had become its hunting ground. I was no longer alone. No, I was being watched, being played with. And a new, more terrifying thought began to take root, pushing aside all reason, all denial. It wasn't just in the cabin. It was trying to get out of the attic. Or perhaps it was trying to get in to my room. And I had no idea what it was. The morning after the scratching was a blur of raw nerves and a terror so profound it felt physical. My body was a taut wire, strung too tight, vibrating with residual fear. The silence that followed the cessation of the scratching was not a relief, but a suffocating blanket. It was the silence of a predator, resting, regrouping, or perhaps simply waiting for me to make my next move. Every muscle in my body screamed for sleep, but my mind was a frantic kaleidoscope of images. The smooth gray stones, the shadows that weren't shadows, the relentless tap, 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 and now the deliberate, patient scratching above my head. I couldn't stay in bed. The ceiling felt too thin, too fragile, a mere membrane separating me from whatever it was. I dragged myself out, my limbs stiff and heavy as if I'd been running all night. The cabin, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a death trap, every creak and groan a potential warning. I walked through the living room, past the barricaded door, A joke, really, against something that could presumably be in my attic, and into the kitchen. The mug I'd gripped so tightly yesterday was still on the counter, the coffee long cold. I didn't want coffee. I wanted to be anywhere but here. But where could I go? The nearest town was miles away, a good 2-hour drive on winding, unpaved roads. And what would I say?
"Excuse me, officer, but something is scratching in my attic and leaving stones on my pillow." They'd think I was crazy, another city dweller broken by the solitude of the woods. No, this was my problem, my cabin, my terror. I found myself staring up at the ceiling, directly above where my bed lay, where the scratching had emanated from. The attic access panel. It was just a square of plywood, painted to match the ceiling, with a small brass ring to pull down the collapsible ladder. Harmless, innocent, yet now it felt like the gateway to hell. A cold dread seeped into my stomach, twisting it into knots. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that I had to look. I had to see what, if anything, had changed. My hands trembled as I reached for the brass ring. My fingers brushed against the cool metal, and for a moment I froze. A primal instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, to run, to pretend it wasn't there. But the other instinct, the one that needed to know, was stronger. With a shaky pull, the panel creaked, resisting for a moment before giving way. The old wooden ladder unfolded with a series of groans and thuds, kicking up a fine dust that shimmered in the weak morning light filtering through the kitchen window. The smell of old wood, dust, and something else. Something faintly musty and metallic, like old blood. I hesitated at the foot of the ladder, staring into the dark square opening above. It was a black maw, deeper and more menacing than I remembered. I grabbed a flashlight from a drawer, its beam weak and yellow against the oppressive darkness. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, but I ignored it, placing my foot on the first rung. The wood groaned under my weight, each step an eternity. As I ascended, the air grew colder, heavier. The musty smell intensified, and now I could detect another scent, something faintly acrid like burnt hair or ozone. My heart hammered against my ribs, threatening to burst. I reached the top, my head poking through the opening, the flashlight beam cutting a path through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, thick and swirling. The attic was small, just a crawl space really, with a low-pitched roof. Old boxes covered in cobwebs were stacked haphazardly. My gaze swept across them, searching, dreading what I might find. Then I saw it. Directly above where my bed would be, the wooden floorboards of the attic, right near the edge of the access opening, were scored. Deep, ugly gouges, long and irregular, as if something with powerful, sharp claws had systematically worked at them. They weren't just scratches, they were furrows, some deep enough to splinter the wood. And they weren't random. They formed a rough, uneven circle, almost like a crude, primitive symbol, or perhaps a boundary. But within that circle, one particular spot was worn smooth, almost polished, as if something had been pressing against it, rubbing for a very long time. And then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound coming from the far corner of the attic, just beyond the range of my flashlight beam. It was soft, hesitant, but undeniable. My blood ran cold. It was still here. It hadn't left. It was just hiding or waiting. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, the flashlight beam shaking violently in my hand. My eyes darted to the corner, trying to pierce the shadows, but it was too dark. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the frantic thudding of my own heart. I could feel its presence, a cold, watchful weight in the air.
It was aware of me. It knew I was here. A new wave of terror, raw and visceral, washed over me. It wasn't just in the attic, it was with me, in the attic. And it had been there all along, above my head, while I slept, while I ate, while I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I backed away slowly, my eyes still fixed on that dark corner, my hand fumbling for the ladder. My foot missed a rung, and I nearly fell, catching myself just in time, a gasp escaping my lips. The sound seemed to echo in the small space, and for a split second I thought I heard a soft, dry rustle from the corner, like something shifting, something moving, just out of sight. I scrambled down the ladder, my movements clumsy and panicked, hitting the floor with a jarring thud. I quickly pushed the ladder back up, shoving the panel closed with all my might, the brass ring clanging against the wood. I locked it, or at least I tried to. The old latch didn't feel secure enough. I needed more. I dragged a heavy armchair directly under the panel, then piled books on top of it, anything to create a barrier, a psychological wall against the unseen terror lurking above. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. My mind raced, fragments of thoughts colliding. It had been there. It was still there. It had been scratching, not to get out, but perhaps to make its presence known, to mark its territory. Or worse, to wear down the barrier, to make a way. The cabin, my once peaceful sanctuary, was now a cage, and I was trapped inside with a silent, patient, and increasingly bold entity. It wasn't just observing me anymore, it was interacting. It was leaving stones, it was scratching. It was making its intentions clear. And those intentions, I now understood with a chilling certainty, were not benign. I was no longer the sole occupant.
And it was only a matter of time before it found a way through. The question wasn't if, but when, and what would happen then. My breath hitched. I was alone, truly alone, and whatever was in my attic was just getting started. The barricade. It felt like a child's fort, a pathetic attempt to ward off a nightmare made real. I slumped against the wall opposite, heart still hammering, breath ragged. The books on the armchair seemed to mock me, their words offering no comfort, no escape from the suffocating reality. The cabin, once my haven, was now a cage, and I was trapped inside with a predator that had just revealed itself to be far more present, far more deliberate than I had dared to imagine. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a siege. The silence that followed was heavy, a thick blanket of dread. I strained my ears, listening for any shift, any creak from above, any indication that my flimsy barricade had been disturbed. Nothing, only the frantic thrum of blood in my ears. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, a statue of pure terror, eyes fixed on the ceiling panel, willing it to remain undisturbed. The morning light, once a source of comfort, now felt weak and insufficient, barely pushing back the shadows that clung to every corner. My mind was a whirlwind of frantic thoughts. What was it? How long had it been there? Was it always in the attic, or had it found its way in more recently? The scratches on the floorboards, the worn smooth spot, that suggested a long, patient presence. It had been above me all this time, observing, waiting. The thought made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a wild animal or some random spirit. This thing had intelligence, it had motive, and now it knew I knew. The hunger and exhaustion were like physical blows, but I couldn't move. Every muscle was tensed, ready to spring, though I had no idea where I would go or what I would do. Eventually, the need for water became undeniable. With excruciating slowness, I pushed myself up, my gaze never leaving the ceiling. I crept to the kitchen, every shadow a potential threat, every creak of the floorboards a jolt of terror. I filled a glass with water, my hand shaking so violently I spilled half of it.
The cold liquid did little to quench the parched fear in my throat. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a raccoon somehow trapped up there. But raccoons don't leave perfectly oval, smooth stones. Raccoons don't scratch in rhythmic patterns. Raccoons don't feel like a cold, knowing presence. No, this was something else entirely. Something ancient, perhaps. Something that had claimed these woods long before I arrived and now saw me as an intruder. The day dragged on, an endless cycle of paranoia and watchful waiting. I didn't dare to eat. I didn't dare to sleep. My eyes burned, my head throbbed. I moved through the cabin like a ghost, hugging the walls, avoiding the center of rooms, as if that would somehow make me less visible, less vulnerable. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, its weak beam a pathetic weapon against an unseen enemy. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and ominous grays, a new dread began to creep in. Night. Night was when it was strongest. Night was when the sounds came. I knew I couldn't spend another night huddled in terror, waiting for whatever was above me to make its next move. I had to get out. But as I moved towards the front door, my hand reaching for the deadbolt, a new thought, colder than any winter wind, froze me in place. What if it wasn't just in the attic? What if it was already outside? The memory of the shadows moving beyond the tree line, too solid for a deer. The coffee mug on the porch, turned upside down. Had it been testing the perimeter, marking its territory? I peered through the small window beside the door, my breath fogging the glass. The woods were a solid, impenetrable wall of black and deeper black, the trees swaying gently in a non-existent breeze. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded amplified, sinister. It felt like 1,000 eyes were watching me from the darkness, waiting for me to step out, to make myself vulnerable. The cabin, for all its terror, was at least a known quantity. Outside, the wilderness felt boundless and its dangers unfathomable. I pulled back from the window, a whimper escaping my lips. I was trapped between the known horror inside and the unknown, potentially greater horror outside. The realization was a crushing weight. I retreated to the living room, collapsing onto the sofa, my gaze still fixed on the ceiling. The barricade seemed even more fragile now. The armchair, the books, they were just symbols of my desperation, not actual barriers. As the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, the cabin plunged into a profound, suffocating darkness. I didn't dare turn on any lights. It felt like drawing attention to myself, like signaling my exact location to the thing. Then it began. Not from the attic, not yet, but from the kitchen. A faint clink, like ceramic on wood. My head snapped towards the sound, my heart leaping into my throat. I hadn't touched anything since getting water. I hadn't left anything out. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another sound, a soft, rhythmic tap. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the kitchen, near the sink. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a small, smooth stone being gently tapped against a porcelain surface. My blood ran cold. It had found its way downstairs.
Or it had always been able to move freely and was simply choosing to reveal itself now. I rose slowly, flashlight beam cutting a trembling arc through the darkness. I crept towards the kitchen, each step an agony. The tapping continued, slow, deliberate, almost playful. Tap, tap, tap. It was mocking me. It was inviting me. I reached the doorway, flashlight beam shaking. On the pristine white porcelain of the kitchen sink, laid out in a neat row, were 5 of the perfectly smooth gray stones, each one identical to the one I had found on my table and later on my pillow. And then I saw it, the 6th stone.
It was being tapped gently, methodically, against the edge of the sink by something that was just out of sight, behind the faucet, hidden in the shadows. My breath hitched, my mind screamed. It was here, in the kitchen, with me. I could hear the faint scuff of something against the counter, a soft, almost imperceptible shift of weight. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. Then, a new sound, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't animalistic, not like a bear or a wolf. It was deeper, resonating from somewhere within the shadows of the kitchen, a sound that felt ancient and malevolent, vibrating through the very floorboards beneath my feet. My flashlight beam, still trembling, slowly panned across the sink, past the row of stones, and then it landed on it. Not a full figure, not a clear shape, just 2 points of light, glowing faintly red, deep within the shadows behind the faucet. Eyes. They weren't reflecting the light, they were emitting it, and they were staring directly at me. Unblinking, patient, hungry. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, rolling to a stop, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling. The kitchen plunged back into near-total darkness, save for those 2 malevolent, glowing red pinpricks. The growl deepened, a low rumble that filled the room, vibrating in my chest. I could feel its gaze, a physical weight pressing down on me. It was no longer just a feeling. It was here. It was real, and it was no longer hiding. I stumbled backwards, a choked scream caught in my throat, my legs suddenly useless. The cabin wasn't just a cage, it was a tomb, and I was already inside. I kept the flashlight clutched in my hand, its weak beam a pathetic shield against the encroaching darkness. Night fell again, swift and unforgiving. The cabin was a black hole, sucking away all light, all hope. I huddled in the living room, far from the attic access, but every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, hinting at movement. My eyes burned, my head throbbed with the relentless rhythm of my fear. The barricade, the armchair, the stacked books sat directly under the panel like a monument to my desperate, futile hope.
Then it began again, a faint creak directly above. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to be the house settling, a branch, anything but what I knew it was. But it wasn't. It was slow, deliberate, a soft, rhythmic pressure, almost like something pressing down on the attic floorboards, right where the worn spot was. Thump, pause, thump, pause. Each sound vibrated through the very structure of the cabin, through the floor, up my legs, into my chest. Then came the scratching. Not the hesitant, exploring scratching from before. This was different. This was forceful. It sounded like fingernails, impossibly long and sharp, dragging across rough wood, not just testing, but tearing. A high-pitched, grating screech that made my teeth ache. It was coming from the panel itself, directly above the armchair. A fine dust, almost imperceptible at first, began to sift down from the edges of the panel, shimmering in the weak beam of my flashlight. My body locked up, my muscles seized. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound intensified, becoming a frantic, desperate clawing. The wood of the panel groaned, a deep, resonant complaint. A splinter, thin as a needle, dropped onto the armchair. Then another. The air grew colder, the acrid, metallic smell returning, stronger now, almost suffocating. It smelled like a wound, like something ancient and festering. The barricade began to shift. The books on top of the armchair teetered precariously. Then one, a heavy hardback, slid off and hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed like a gunshot in the terrifying silence that briefly followed the book's fall. The scraping stopped. I stared, wide-eyed, at the panel. The brass ring, which had been flat against the wood, was now slightly angled, as if something had pushed up from underneath. Then, with a sickening crack, a hairline fissure appeared in the painted wood of the panel, just to the left of the brass ring. It spiderwebbed outwards, growing longer, deeper. Another crack joined it, crisscrossing like a shattered pane of glass. The entire panel began to bulge downwards, slowly, inexorably, like a cancerous growth. Dust rained down in earnest now, coating the armchair, settling on my hair, my clothes. A low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard, rumbled from above, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones, bypassing my ears entirely. It was a sound of ancient hunger, of predatory patience finally wearing thin. It wasn't just trying to get out, it was trying to get to me. I scrambled to my feet, dropping the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling, illuminating the horrifying spectacle. I had to get out, but where? The front door was still barricaded with chairs, a pathetic joke. The windows were old, stuck, and I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever was up there would be faster than me once it was free.
The growl intensified, becoming a ragged, wet sound, like something ripping apart flesh. The panel groaned again, a louder, more agonizing sound. The cracks widened, and then a single, long, black, impossibly thin finger, tipped with a wickedly sharp, obsidian-like claw, slowly, deliberately pierced through the center of the panel, right where the cracks converged. It twisted, slowly, methodically, widening the hole, splintering the wood with a deliberate, horrifying ease. My scream caught in my throat, a choked, silent gasp of pure, unadulterated terror. The finger retracted, then reappeared, followed by another and another, until a cluster of those horrifying claws were tearing at the wood, pulling it apart from the inside. The hole grew larger, revealing a glimpse of utter blackness behind it, a void that seemed to absorb the weak light of my fallen flashlight. A cold, wet breath ghosted over my face, even though the thing was still in the attic. It was an impossible sensation, a manifestation of its proximity, its hunger. The smell of blood, of ozone, of something indescribably foul, filled my lungs, making me gag. I could see 2 pinpricks of dull red light glowing from within the blackness of the hole, like malevolent eyes. The panel was giving way. With a final explosive crack, a large section of the wood ripped free, falling onto the armchair with a crash. The books scattered, a torrent of dust and debris cascaded down. And there, framed in the gaping hole, silhouetted against the deeper darkness of the attic, was a head. Not human, not animal, something else, something ancient and twisted, with those 2 burning red points for eyes, and a mouth that seemed to stretch too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. It slowly, deliberately lowered itself through the opening, its gaze fixed on me, a predatory intelligence burning in those crimson depths. It was finally here, and I knew, with the last vestiges of my sanity, that it had never intended to let me leave. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to come for me, and that moment was now. That moment, it stretches on, doesn't it? An endless now. The cabin, my sanctuary, my tomb. It was never truly mine, I see that clearly now. I was merely a temporary occupant, a fleeting warmth in a place that has known an ancient, cold presence for far longer than any human memory. The eyes, those burning red pinpricks, they weren't just looking at me. They were looking through me, into me. And what they saw, they claimed. I don't remember the exact details of what came next. The fear was too vast, too absolute. It swallowed everything. But I remember the feeling, the crushing weight, the cold embrace, the slow, agonizing realization that I was no longer an individual, no longer simply me. I was becoming part of the echo, part of the silence, part of the watchful woods themselves. The sounds don't bother me anymore.
The scratching, the tapping, the faint whispers, they are just extensions of what I now am. I hear the wind through the pines, the crackle of a fire in a distant hearth, and the frantic drumbeat of another heart, just like mine once was, seeking peace in these forgotten woods. Oh, the irony! They come, you see, they always do, drawn by the promise of quiet, of escape, and I watch them. From the shadows that stretch too long, from the faint rustling under the floorboards, from the attic, always from the attic. I'm just another set of eyes now, another part of the cabin's silent welcome, another stone. So, tell me, have you ever felt it? That prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched when you know you're alone? Have you ever heard a sound that couldn't be explained, a whisper just beyond hearing? Perhaps you too have sought solace in a place that seemed empty. Perhaps you too have found that some places are never truly empty. They are just waiting for you to fill the silence. And once you do, they'll never let you leave.